Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. I'm so happy to have each and every one of you here today. This space is filled with love, passion, and stories that bring us all closer together. Your support means everything to me, and I'm beyond excited to share today's journey with you. Before we begin, let's take a moment to lift our hearts in prayer. Heavenly Father, bless this beautiful family and surround them with your love and protection. Guide their hearts and minds, filling them with peace and joy each day. Thank you for the gift of this community. May we grow stronger together in your grace. Amen. Now let's dive into today's story, and remember, the surprise is coming at the end. Stay tuned and let's share love and positivity together. The late autumn sun painted Manhattan's skyline in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dylan Luca's penthouse office. At 35, he stood at the pinnacle of New York's corporate world, his silhouette cutting a commanding figure against the city's glittering backdrop. The tailored Tom Ford suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders as he watched the city pulse 60 stories below, his mind replaying the events of the morning's board meeting over and over. For the first time in his 15-year reign as CEO of Luca Enterprises, Dylan had been outmaneuvered. The taste of defeat was foreign on his tongue, bitter yet strangely intoxicating because it came from her, Blakely Navy. The memory of her entrance into the boardroom was seared into his mind. She had commanded attention without demanding it, her Hermes heels clicking against the marble floor with quiet confidence. The charcoal pencil skirt and cream silk blouse spoke of understated elegance, but it was her eyes that had captured him. Amber flames danced in those irises, intelligence and determination radiating from every glance. Dylan's fingers traced the cool glass of the window as he remembered how she had systematically dismantled his acquisition strategy. Her voice, smooth as aged whiskey, but sharp as a razor's edge, had cut through every argument his team presented. She hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't needed to. Every word was precisely chosen, every point delivered with devastating accuracy. "Mr. Luca," she had said, her gaze meeting his across the polished expanse of the conference table. "Your offer undervalues not just our assets, but our potential. Navy Financial isn't just another trophy for your collection." The corner of his mouth curved up at the memory. Trophy. If anyone was worthy of that term, it was Blakely herself. But she wasn't a prize to be won. She was a force of nature, a brilliant storm that had blown through his carefully ordered world and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about desire. His phone buzzed, drawing his attention to the latest market reports. Luca Enterprises stock had dipped slightly after the failed acquisition attempt, but Dylan barely registered the numbers. Instead, his mind wandered to the intelligence he'd gathered about Blakely Navy over the past few hours. Harvard Business School, summa cum laude, youngest partner in Navy Financial's history, philanthropist with a focus on inner-city education. No scandals, no controversies, just a sterling reputation built on intelligence and integrity. The society pages occasionally mentioned her at charity galas, but she kept her private life carefully guarded. Dylan moved to his desk, fingers hovering over the invitation to tonight's Metropolitan Museum charity gala. He had nearly cancelled, his pride still smarting from the morning's defeat. But now, knowing she would be there, wild horses couldn't keep him away. The sun dipped lower, casting his office in deepening shadows. Dylan loosened his tie, running a hand through his dark hair as he contemplated his next move. In the cutthroat world of Manhattan finance, he had earned a reputation as a strategic genius, the king of calculated risks. But something about Blakely Navy made him want to throw calculation to the wind. His assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Mr. Luca, your car is ready." "Thank you, Claire." He gathered his things, each movement deliberate as he prepared for the evening ahead. The weight of his watch, a Patek Philippe handed down from his father, reminded him of everything he had built, everything he stood to lose if he made the wrong move. But for the first time in his life, the potential for loss thrilled rather than terrified him. The elevator ride to the lobby gave him time to study his reflection in the mirrored walls. The same face that had graced countless magazine covers stared back at him, strong jawline, penetrating blue eyes, the slight curl of dark hair at his temples that gave him a rakish air despite his polished appearance. Women had always found him attractive, but their interest had always seemed tied to his bank account rather than his character. Blakely had looked at him differently. When she'd challenged him in that boardroom, her gaze had stripped away his wealth, his status, his carefully constructed facade. She had seen him, really seen him, and found him wanting. The thought should have angered him, but instead it lit a fire in his chest. The lobby of Lucca Tower was quiet at this hour, his footsteps echoing across Italian marble as he made his way to the waiting car. James, his driver of 10 years, held the door with a knowing smile. "The Metropolitan Museum, sir?" "Yes, James." Dylan settled into the leather seat, his mind already racing ahead to the evening. But take the scenic route through the park. As the car glided into Manhattan traffic, Dylan found himself remembering more details from the morning. The way Blakely's fingers had wrapped around her Mont Blanc pen, the subtle fragrance of jasmine that drifted across the table when she leaned forward to make a point, the slight tilt of her head when she was considering her next move. Central Park passed by in a blur of autumn colors, but Dylan barely noticed. He was too busy planning his approach. The usual techniques wouldn't work with someone like Blakely Navy. She would see through any artificial charm, any practiced lines. For the first time in years, he would have to be completely genuine. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his brother, Alexander. "Heard about the Navy financial deal? Tough break. Drowning your sorrows at the gala." Dylan's reply was cryptic. "Sometimes losing opens up unexpected opportunities." The car turned onto Fifth Avenue, joining the line of luxury vehicles depositing Manhattan's elite at the Metropolitan Museum's imposing entrance. Through the tinted windows, Dylan caught glimpses of flowing gowns and camera flashes. Somewhere in that glittering crowd, Blakely Navy waited. James opened the car door, and Dylan emerged into the cool evening air. The steps of the Met were illuminated like a scene from a dream, with hundreds of tiny lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. As he straightened his bow tie and prepared to ascend, Dylan felt something he hadn't experienced since his first major acquisition: butterflies in his stomach. The grand entrance hall of the Metropolitan Museum had been transformed for the evening. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the marble floors, while arrangements of white orchids and roses created an atmosphere of ethereal elegance. The city's most powerful figures moved through the space like pieces on a chessboard, each interaction carefully calculated for maximum advantage. Dylan accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, using the moment to scan the crowd. Every few steps, someone would try to engage him in conversation about the markets, about his latest tech ventures, about the upcoming social season. He responded with practiced ease, but his attention remained divided. And then he saw her. Blakely Navy stood near the Temple of Dender, the ancient Egyptian structure providing a dramatic backdrop for her entrance. The emerald silk of her gown caught the light like liquid jewels, flowing over her curves with breathtaking elegance. Her dark skin glowed golden in the warm lighting, and her hair was swept up in an intricate style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She was engaged in conversation with the city's ballet director, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. Even from a distance, Dylan could see the passion in her gestures, The same intensity that had captivated him in the boardroom now directed toward what appeared to be a discussion of the arts. His heart began to race, a sensation so foreign that it took him a moment to identify it. Dylan Luca, the man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was nervous about approaching a woman at a charity gala. But Blakely Navy was no ordinary woman. He watched as she excused herself from her conversation, moving toward the bar with that same fluid grace he remembered from the morning. Without conscious thought, his feet began carrying him in the same direction. The crowd seemed to part before him, whether from his reputation or the intensity of his expression. He neither knew nor cared. She sensed his approach. He could tell by the subtle straightening of her spine, the slight pause in her step. When she turned to face him, those amber eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and Dylan felt his world narrow to this single moment. "Mr. Luca," she greeted him, her voice carrying that same whiskey-smooth quality that had haunted his thoughts all day. "Come to negotiate better terms." The playful challenge in her tone made his pulse quicken. "Actually," he replied, signaling the bartender for 2 fresh glasses of champagne, "I came to admit defeat, and perhaps—" He paused, holding her gaze as he offered her one of the glasses, "to negotiate something entirely different." A hint of curiosity flickered across her features as she accepted the champagne. "I wasn't aware the great Dylan Luca ever admitted defeat." "There's a lot you don't know about me, Ms. Navy." He took a deliberate sip of his champagne, never breaking eye contact. "Though I find myself hoping to change that." The ghost of a smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Careful, Mr. Luca. People might think you're flirting with the enemy." "Enemy is such a harsh word," he countered, taking a step closer. The subtle scent of jasmine enveloped him again, making his head spin more than any champagne could. "I prefer to think of us as worthy opponents." A soft laugh escaped her lips, the sound sending shivers down his spine. "And what does a worthy opponent propose?" Dylan's voice dropped lower, meant for her ears alone. "One night, no business, no negotiations, no hidden agendas. Just 2 people getting to know each other beyond the boardroom." She studied him with those penetrating eyes, and Dylan felt as though she could see straight through to his soul. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. "You're used to getting what you want, aren't you, Mr. Luca?" "Not from you," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. "That's what makes you fascinating." The orchestra began to play, the soft strains of a waltz floating through the air. Blakely took a thoughtful sip of her champagne, and Dylan found himself mesmerized by the movement of her throat, the way her long fingers wrapped around the delicate stem of the glass. "One night," she finally said, placing her empty glass on a passing waiter's tray. "But don't mistake curiosity for surrender, Mr. Luca." "Dylan," he corrected softly, offering his hand. "If we're leaving business behind, I think we can dispense with formalities." Her fingers slipped into his, and electricity shot through his entire body. "Dylan," she tested the name, and he had never heard it sound more perfect. "Shall we see if you're as skilled at dancing as you are at corporate takeovers?" As he led her to the dance floor, Dylan knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same after this night. The woman in his arms had already begun to remake his world, and he couldn't wait to discover what other changes she would bring. The night stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of promise and possibility. And as they began to move to the music, their bodies finding a natural rhythm together, Dylan realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be anywhere else but here, in this moment, with this extraordinary woman who had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself. The magnetic pull that had drawn him to her that morning had only grown stronger. As they danced beneath the sparkling chandeliers, surrounded by the elite of Manhattan society, Dylan Luca understood that he was standing on the edge of something profound, and for once in his life, he was ready to take a leap without calculating the risks. Because some things he was beginning to learn were worth risking everything for. Chapter 2. Electric Touch. The Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall breathed with ancient magic that night, its marble columns reaching skyward like silent guardians of the evening's possibilities. Through the expansive glass ceiling, stars winked down at the gathering of New York's elite, as if they too were curious about the story unfolding beneath them. The Temple of Denda cast long shadows across the polished floor, its weathered stone a testament to enduring passions. Blakely Navy felt the weight of the evening settling around her shoulders like a silk shawl. The emerald gown she wore, a custom Versace creation, whispered against the marble floor with each step, its color a striking contrast against her dark skin. She had chosen it carefully, not for the generous donors or society photographers, but for herself. Tonight, she needed to feel invincible. The morning's victory over Luca Enterprises still sang in her veins, but it was tempered by something else, something that made her pulse quicken every time she remembered piercing blue eyes and the way they had studied her across the boardroom table. Dylan Luca had been everything the magazines claimed. Devastatingly handsome, commanding, intense. But they hadn't captured the electricity that seemed to crackle in the air around him. The magnetic pull that made it impossible to look away. She lifted a hand to touch the collar of diamonds at her throat, her grandmother's legacy and a reminder of everything she had worked for. 3 generations of Navy women had fought to create something lasting in a world that tried to deny them at every turn. She wouldn't let one magnetically attractive CEO distract her from that legacy, no matter how his gaze made her skin tingle. The string quartet's music floated through the air, mixing with the gentle murmur of conversations and the crystalline sound of champagne glasses clinking. Blakely moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting compliments on her successful defense against the Luca takeover with gracious smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Her mind kept drifting back to the dance they had shared, to the way Dylan's hand had felt against the small of her back. Strong and sure, yet somehow gentle. "Ms. Navy," a familiar voice called, and she turned to see Richard Montgomery, one of her firm's biggest clients, approaching with his wife. "Spectacular work this morning, the way you handled Luca. I haven't seen anything like it in 20 years on Wall Street." Blakely accepted the praise with a modest nod, but before she could respond, she felt it. That electric charge in the air that meant he was near. She didn't need to turn around to know Dylan Luca had entered the room. The subtle shift in the energy of the crowd, the way conversations hushed and reformed around his presence, told her everything. "Thank you, Richard," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart had begun to race. "But tonight isn't about business deals. How is Clara's scholarship foundation coming along?" As Mrs. Montgomery launched into an enthusiastic description of their latest charitable venture, Blakely allowed herself one glance over her shoulder. Dylan stood near the entrance, his black tuxedo impeccably tailored to his athletic frame. The sight of him made her breath catch. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew his own power, yet there was something different about him tonight. A vulnerability in the way he searched the crowd that made her wonder if he was looking for her. Their eyes met across the sea of evening gowns and tuxedos, and the world seemed to still. The chandelier light caught the silver at his temples, and his lips curved into a smile that seemed meant only for her. Blakely felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly turned back to her conversation, but her skin tingled with the knowledge that he was watching. She excused herself from the Montgomerys and made her way toward the bar, needing a moment to collect herself. The bartender was just placing a glass of champagne in front of her when she felt his presence behind her, like a warm shadow that carried the scent of cedar and something uniquely masculine. "I believe I owe you a dance." Dylan's voice was low and intimate, sending shivers down her spine. Unless you're still maintaining that professional distance? Blakely turned, champagne glass in hand, to find him even closer than she'd expected. His blue eyes sparkled with challenge and something deeper, a hunger that matched the one she'd been trying to ignore all evening. Professional distance. She arched an eyebrow, fighting to keep her voice level. Is that what you call standing outside my office for 2 hours this afternoon? A flash of surprise crossed his features before his smile widened. You saw me. My assistant has a rather comprehensive security system. She took a deliberate sip of champagne, using the moment to study him. Up close, she could see the faint stubble along his jaw, evidence that he'd been too preoccupied to shave again before the gala. The detail humanized him somehow, made him more than just the corporate titan whose face graced magazine covers. And yet you didn't send security to escort me away, he noted, his voice carrying a hint of triumph. Could it be that the formidable Blakely Navy was curious about why I stayed? The orchestra began a new piece, Strauss's Blue Danube Waltz, and Dylan held out his hand. The gesture was both an invitation and a challenge, just like the man himself. Blakely found herself setting down her champagne glass and placing her hand in his before she could second-guess the decision. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and that same electric current she'd felt during their first dance shot through her body. He led her onto the dance floor with the confidence of a man who had spent years in ballrooms, but there was nothing practiced about the way he drew her into his arms. You never answered my question, he murmured as they began to move with the music. His hand on her waist was respectful, but possessed a gentle pressure that made her intensely aware of every point of contact between them. About why I didn't have you removed. Blakely matched his steps perfectly, her body somehow knowing exactly how to move with his. Perhaps I wanted to see how long the great Dylan Luca would wait when he wasn't getting what he wanted. His laugh was genuine, rumbling through his chest in a way she could feel against her palm. And what did you conclude from your experiment? That you're either more patient or more stubborn than your reputation suggests. She allowed him to guide her through a turn, their bodies moving, closer together as they navigated around other couples. I haven't decided which yet. Maybe I'm something else entirely. His voice dropped lower, meant only for her ears. Something your research and reputation reports couldn't reveal. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. This close, she could see flecks of steel gray in the blue of his irises, could feel the strength in his frame carefully held in check as he led her through the dance. Everything about him radiated power and control, yet there was a gentleness in the way his thumb traced small circles on her hand that made her wonder what else those business reports had missed. And what would that be? She challenged, trying to maintain her composure despite the way her heart was racing. Dylan guided her into another turn, this one bringing them even closer together. When he spoke, his lips were near her ear, his breath warm against her skin. Let me show you. Have dinner with me tonight, somewhere away from all this pretense. Just Dylan and Blakely, no titles, no corporate warfare. The invitation hung between them like a glittering thread of possibility. Blakely knew she should refuse. She had built her career on careful decisions, on never letting emotion cloud her judgment. But there was something in Dylan's eyes that spoke to a part of her she'd kept carefully hidden. The part that believed in magic and midnight possibilities. Your negotiations need work, she said finally, her lips curving into a smile. That sounded more like a command than an invitation. His answering smile was both rueful and charming. You're right. I'm used to being in control. But with you... He spun her out and drew her back in one fluid movement that left her breathless. With you, I'm learning to ask instead of demand. "Please, Blakely, have dinner with me." The music was building to its crescendo, and couples whirled around them in a blur of color and motion. But Blakely saw only Dylan, saw the genuine hope in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw that betrayed how much her answer meant to him. "One dinner," she conceded, feeling something shift in the air between them. "But not at Le Bernardin or Daniel or any other place where we'll be surrounded by board members and shareholders." The joy that lit up his face transformed him from handsome to breathtaking. "I know just the place. Trust me?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Blakely studied him for a long moment as the music began to fade. "I trust you to choose a restaurant," she said carefully. "The rest remains to be seen." Dylan's hand tightened slightly on her waist as the dance ended, as if reluctant to let her go. "I'll take that as a challenge rather than a rejection." He stepped back and brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent sparks of electricity up her arm. "Shall we?" Without waiting for her answer, he began leading her through the crowd toward the museum's grand entrance. Blakely felt the eyes of Manhattan's elite following their progress, knew there would be speculation in tomorrow's society pages. But for once, she found she didn't care. The night air was crisp when they emerged onto the museum steps, carrying the first hints of autumn. Dylan's hand found the small of her back as he guided her down to where a sleek black Bentley waited at the curb. The driver, James, she remembered from her background research on Luca Enterprises, held the door with a discreet smile. "After you," Dylan murmured, and as Blakely slid into the leather interior, she felt as though she was crossing a threshold that would change everything. The way Dylan looked at her as he joined her in the car, his eyes dark with promise in the city lights, told her he felt it too. As the car pulled away from the curb, Blakely Navy, the woman who had built her reputation on never taking unnecessary risks, found herself excited by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The night stretched before them like an unwritten story, and for the first time in years, she wanted to see how it would end. The Bentley glided through Manhattan streets, and Blakely watched the city lights dance across Dylan's profile. He was speaking quietly with James about their destination, and the intimate domesticity of the moment struck her. This wasn't the corporate raider from the morning's boardroom, or even the polished society figure from the gala. This was simply Dylan, a man who had waited in the rain just to see her again. Perhaps, she thought, as his hand found hers in the darkness of the car, some risks were worth taking after all. The city seemed to hold its breath around them, as if it too was waiting to see what would happen when two forces of nature collided. As they turned onto a quiet street in Little Italy, Blakely felt the last of her professional armor falling away, replaced by a sensation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: possibility. Whatever happened next, she knew this night would change everything, and for once that thought didn't terrify her, it thrilled her to her core. Chapter 3. Walls of Glass. The Bentleys slowed to a stop on a quiet cobblestone street in Little Italy, where strings of warm lights crisscrossed overhead like a canopy of stars. Blakely felt Dylan's eyes on her as she took in their surroundings, the historic buildings with their wrought iron fire escapes and window boxes still blooming with late autumn flowers. This wasn't the Manhattan of gleaming skyscrapers and power lunches. This was a pocket of old-world charm that seemed to exist in its own time stream. La Piccola Rosa, Dylan said softly as James opened the car door. "It's been in the same family for 4 generations. No Michelin stars, no write-ups in the Times, just authentic Italian food and privacy," Blakely finished, understanding dawning as she accepted his hand and stepped onto the cobblestones. Her stilettos clicked against the ancient stone as Dylan guided her toward an unmarked wooden door with frosted glass windows that glowed warmly from within. The door opened before they reached it, and an elderly Italian woman with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes greeted them with obvious affection. "Dylan, il mio ragazzo, and who is this beautiful signorina?" "Mama Rosa." Dylan's face lit up with genuine warmth as he bent to kiss her cheeks. "This is Blakely Navy. Blakely meet Rosalinda Castellano, the heart and soul of La Piccola Rosa, and the woman who made sure I didn't starve during my first year of building Luca Enterprises." "Ah, he exaggerates." Mama Rosa waved off the praise, but her eyes sparkled as she took Blakely's hands in hers. "But this one, he worked too hard back then. All day in his tiny office, forgetting to eat until I would bring him pasta. Now look at him, a big shot who still remembers his old friends." Something in Blakely's chest tightened at the image of a younger Dylan, hungry and determined, being cared for by this maternal figure. It was so far from the polished CEO image he presented to the world, yet it felt more real than any magazine profile she'd read about him. Mama Rosa led them through the intimate restaurant, past tables where couples and families sat enjoying their meals without a single phone or camera in sight. The walls were covered in black and white photographs documenting the restaurant's history, and the air was rich with the aromas of garlic, fresh herbs, and wood-fired bread. Their table was in a private alcove lit by candles and a single pendant lamp that cast a soft golden glow. A bottle of wine was already breathing in a crystal decanter, and fresh flowers, white roses and sprigs of lavender created a simple but elegant centerpiece. Dylan held her chair with old-world courtesy, and as Blakely settled into her seat, she caught the lingering scent of his cologne, something subtle and masculine that made her pulse quicken. When he took his own seat across from her, the candlelight caught the angles of his face in a way that softened his usual intensity into something more vulnerable. "So," she said, running a finger along the stem of her wine glass, "this is where Dylan Luca goes when he's not being the king of Wall Street." His lips curved into a smile that held none of his boardroom bravado. "This is where I come to remember who I was before the titles and the acquisitions. When I first moved to New York, I had nothing but ambition and a business plan that every major investor had rejected. I couldn't afford an office, so I would sit here for hours, working on my laptop and drinking endless cups of espresso. Mama Rosa." He paused, his expression softening with memory. "She saw something in me worth believing in." Blakely felt her carefully constructed walls wavering as she watched him pour the wine, a vintage Barolo that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, yet he served it with the same unpretentious grace that seemed to characterize this hidden sanctuary. "And now?" she asked, accepting her glass. "What does the great Dylan Luca believe in?" Their eyes met over the rim of their wine glasses, and the air between them charged with electricity. "Tonight, I believe in taking chances, in the possibility that sometimes losing a corporate battle might lead to winning something far more valuable." The wine was exceptional, its complex notes of roses and tar dancing on her tongue, but it was Dylan's gaze that made her feel intoxicated. There was something disarming about him here, away from the spotlight that usually followed his every move. The sharp business suit had been replaced by an expertly tailored tuxedo that he wore with casual elegance, his bow tie now slightly loosened in a way that drew her eyes to the strong column of his throat. "You're very sure of yourself," she observed, though her tone held more warmth than criticism. "What makes you think I'm interested in being won?" Dylan leaned forward slightly, the candlelight creating shadows that emphasized the intensity of his expression. "Because you're here, Blakely. You could have dismissed me as another corporate raider trying to add your company to his collection. You could have had security remove me from your building this afternoon. You could have turned down my dinner invitation. But something made you say yes, the same something that made me stand in the rain for 2 hours just to see you again." Before she could respond, Mama Rosa appeared with a plate of antipasti that hadn't been ordered but looked absolutely perfect. Fresh burrata with heirloom tomatoes, paper-thin prosciutto, marinated artichokes, and olives that glistened in the candlelight. "Eat, eat!" she insisted, her maternal instincts apparently extending to all of Dylan's guests. "You young people work too hard, forget to enjoy life's pleasures. Love needs good food to grow strong." Blakely felt heat rise to her cheeks at the assumption, but Dylan's laugh was warm and genuine. "Grazie, Mama Rosa, everything looks wonderful." As the elderly woman bustled away, Blakely found herself studying Dylan with new eyes. The way he interacted with Mama Rosa revealed layers she hadn't expected, a capacity for genuine connection that went beyond networking and business relationships. "You're surprised," he noted, offering her the burrata with a gesture that managed to be both gallant and natural. "Did you expect me to take you to the latest trendy restaurant where we'd be surrounded by paparazzi and social climbers?" "Honestly, yes." Blakely accepted the offering, the fresh cheese melting on her tongue in a way that made her close her eyes briefly in pleasure. When she opened them, she found Dylan watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your reputation suggests you enjoy the spotlight." "My reputation," he said thoughtfully, swirling the wine in his glass, "is a carefully crafted tool. It serves its purpose in the business world. But here," he gestured to their intimate surroundings, "this is real. No cameras, no shareholders, no corporate strategies. Just a man hoping to know the woman behind the brilliant mind that outmaneuvered him this morning." The honesty in his voice made something shift inside her chest. Blakely had built her own walls carefully over the years, protecting herself in a world that often viewed her as an anomaly, a young black woman who had risen to the top of the financial world through sheer brilliance and determination. But something about Dylan's vulnerability made her want to lower those defenses just a little. "The woman behind the brilliant mind," she repeated softly, meeting his gaze. "Are you sure you're ready for that, Dylan? I'm not just the ice queen of Wall Street, but I'm also not going to be another conquest for New York's most eligible bachelor." Instead of being offended, Dylan's expression grew more intense. "Do you know what I thought when I first saw you this morning? Before you systematically dismantled my acquisition strategy." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur that sent shivers down her spine. "I thought, finally, someone who sees beyond the surface, who challenges me to be better, who makes me want to prove I'm more than my reputation suggests." The air between them crackled with tension, and Blakely found herself leaning in slightly, drawn by the magnetic pull of his presence. "And what are you trying to prove tonight? That chemistry like this," his hand moved across the table until his fingers were just brushing hers, sending electric currents up her arm, "deserves to be explored. That two people who've spent their lives building walls might find something extraordinary if they dare to be vulnerable with each other." The touch of his fingers against hers was like a live wire, making her skin tingle and her heart race. Blakely knew she should pull away, maintain the professional distance that had served her so well over the years. But something in Dylan's eyes, a mixture of hope, desire, and genuine curiosity, made her leave her hand where it was. "One night," she reminded him, though her voice wasn't as steady as she would have liked. "That was our agreement." His thumb traced a gentle circle on her palm, the simple gesture somehow more intimate than any kiss. "One night to begin with," he corrected softly, "but I think we both know this isn't going to be enough." Before she could respond, Mama Rosa returned with their primi piatti, handmade tagliatelle with white truffles for Dylan and ricotta-filled ravioli in a delicate sage butter sauce for Blakely. The scents were intoxicating, but not as much as the way Dylan's eyes never left her face as their hands reluctantly separated. As they began to eat, their conversation flowed naturally from business to personal passions. Blakely found herself sharing stories about her grandmother, who had started Navy Financial from nothing and taught her the value of both ambition and integrity. Dylan spoke about his younger brother Alexander, who chose to become a doctor instead of joining the family business, and how proud he was of him for following his own path.